Hello, teachers. In this session, I'll be sharing with you some interesting activities for you to help your students experience the different stages of process writing. So let's get started. As a reminder of the different stages of the process of writing, we start with the inventing, and as you know, at that stage, students come up with ideas about the topic that we provide them. At the drafting stage, students make use of those ideas to create a text. But notice something that at the inventing stage, we reassure students that they don't have to care about any mistakes related to grammar or structure, because the purpose is that they get pen to paper and practice the active writing or put their ideas on paper. At the reviewing stage, students start, being aware of any problems related to meaning or organization, and they have to be given a rubric that includes all the items that have to be covered in the text, and see which points are covered and which points need elaboration. Finally, at the editing stage, students start looking at the grammatical mistakes, the spelling, punctuation, grammar, and structure based on a rubric. Okay, so the question is, how can I help my students practice the different stages of the process of writing in a way that is simple and fun? So the answer is through activities and games. And here the first stage is inventing, and here we have three activities for helping students practice that stage. The first activity is cubing, and as you can get from the name, we provide students with a template that has 6 sides. And on each of the 6 sides, we have a point that students have to cover about the topic that you give them. So they have to describe it, compare it, associate it, analyze it, apply it, argue for or argue against it. So to explicate what these mean, let's suggest or let's say that we ask them to write a paragraph about their favorite animal, maybe the giraffe. So we ask students to try to write sentences in answer to these points. So for example, in describing the giraffe, students may say it is tall, or it's not short, it is big, or it's not small. Compare it to try to compare the giraffe with a similar with another animal. Okay, maybe similar or different. So here I want my students to focus on the similarities or differences. And the way students express the comparison or compare the animal to another animal relies on what grammar or structure you taught, because you can apply this with students as young as junior ones or grades 1 and 2, for example. So the idea is all of these are applicable, but the language used is that at the level of the students that you teach. So one way to use comparison, for example, the giraffe is tall, but the elephant is short. So this is one way of comparing. Another way of comparing is by using the comparative, if students have studied that. So for example, the giraffe is taller than the elephant, okay? Associated means that I try to mention the things that come to my mind um, when I say, for example, the name of the animal. So when I say the giraffe, what comes to my mind? Maybe the place the giraffe lives in, maybe the food the giraffe eats. So things related or associated with the giraffe. So at that stage, students may say the giraffe lives in the zoo, for example. Analyze it, the students mention the components or of the giraffe, or they start breaking it down. For example, the giraffe has um, four long legs, or it has patches on its body. Apply it. Here we have to think of whether we write about a concrete object or an animal or animate thing or animates. So if I'm writing about a concrete object like a mobile phone, students may write 2 or 3 sentences about what the mobile phone does or what we do with the mobile phone. If I write about, for example, an animal or a human being, so here I have to say what the animal does. So linking what we say, what we're saying to the giraffe, we can say that the giraffe can reach high trees, for example. This is what it can do. Finally, argue for or against it. So this point tries to encourage students' ability of reflection. The student reflects on what he or she feels when he sees the giraffe. And this can be positive or negative. So there are several ways of expressing this point depending on what structures and grammar your students have learned. So for example, students can use verbs like, dislike, verbs of emotions, verbs of preferences, expressions, okay, like I'd rather, I'd prefer. So you can include in the rubric for this stage that your students use the structures that they've already learned. They also can use positive or negative adjectives. For example, the giraffe is interesting if the student is arguing for, or the giraffe is scary if the student is arguing against. So here, this activity is compelling in the sense that it provides the students with clues on what they write about. Okay, so don't forget that the purpose of this that is to help your students come up with ideas. So how can I conduct that activity? So you can divide your students or your classroom into 3 or 4 groups, depending on the size of your class. And then you provide each group with a template of the cubing activity. And each group is responsible for coming up with ideas covering the 6 points. Another version of this activity is to have your students sit in a big circle, provide them with a piece of paper or a template of the cubing activity, and then each student works on individually on covering the points of the template, and then they share their ideas. Okay, moving on, this is another activity for the inventing stage, which is fast writing. And fast writing means that the students try to write fast about a topic, maybe their favorite animal, whatever you provide them with, okay? Um, and here you can apply the activity in several ways as well. You can divide them into groups, provide each group with a number of paper slips, and each group has in 2 or 3 minutes to come up with as many sentences as they can about the topic they are given. And the group that gets the most sentences is the winner. Another version is to provide your students with a broad newspaper sheet, and then you set a time of 1 to 2 minutes and ask students to write fast about, for example, a topic they are given, and the group that gets the most sentences wins. And you have to make it clear from the very beginning that what they have to focus on is just translating their ideas in words and sentences. No worries about grammar mistakes, no worries about any mistakes. Okay, one third activity for the inventing stage is summarizing. And for this activity, you can use any input source, maybe a movie clip, a video, a reading text, depending on the learning styles of your students, their interests, and your lesson. So for example, if I'm interested in making my students write a short story, it would be useful if I bring a simple short story and set my students into groups, provide each group with a copy of the story and a copy of this template, rising and falling action. And then students in each group have to scan the story or the text and try to summarize the main points of the story on the template. So for example, they have to find out what the rising actions are, the actions or the events leading to the problem, and then they have to use a sentence to describe what the problem is, and then a number of sentences to indicate the following actions or events leading to the solution, and then they have to state what the solution is in a sentence. Because later on, they're going to make use of this information in writing a similar story. Okay, and then we move on to the second stage, which is using the ideas students came up with at the inventing stage and creating a text at the drafting stage. Here are some activities to help your students do that in an interesting way. One activity is the vertical learning. And from its name, vertical means that students do the activity while standing, unlike the traditional way of doing activities at desks and on papers horizontally. So, as you can see, you can set your students in different groups or make them work at the same groups they worked in before. Provide each group with a broad newspaper sheet, and then post the newspaper sheets on the board, different sides or different walls around the classroom, the windows, whatever is available at your classroom. And then you ask them to make use of the ideas they came up with at the inventing stage, and they start, piecing them together in a text on the broad newspaper sheet. And at that stage, you have to provide them with a rubric of the content, the plan, what is needed to be included at the beginning, what is needed to be included in the middle, and what is needed to be included at the end. And by this, I mean what items, what content you want them to cover at each stage. Okay? And at that point, you make it clear that students have to watch their grammar and their structure. Another activity is the hexagonal thinking. And hexagonal thinking means that you will be working on pieces of paper in the shape of hexagons. And here, students start, making use of the ideas they got up with at the inventing stage, write a sentence representing an idea on each hexagon, and then they start in groups to find out what relationships are between each two sentences. For example, is one sentence an addition to another sentence? So they decide to use a linking word like and, for example, to show addition. Is one sentence a reason for another? So they decide to link them using because, is one, for example, a result of another, so they decide to use so. So here we have two objectives, that students try to create a text, pay attention to the organization of sentences, the logical order of sentences in a text, and at the same time they work on a very interesting and very important aspect of drafting, which is linking, how sentences are linked to each other, how sentences are cohesive, and how the sentences are logically organized or coherent. So if you want to work on these purposes, the hexagonal thinking would be interesting and useful. One more activity is documentary film scrolls. This is a nice activity for the drafting stage, and it helps you focus on another aspect, which is the organization or coherence. In other words, the logical organization of ideas. Let's see. So this is a kind of a workshop because students will be, preparing pieces of paper to create roles, create slips in each role, and then they make use of a long piece of paper to be a tape and divide that tape into squares, because they will be transforming their ideas at the inventing stage into sentences on each square. And here attention has to be paid to the point that those sentences have to be sequenced logically. Okay, so at that activity, the focus is on both creating a text, piecing sentences together in the form of a text, and at the same time paying attention to organization or sequence. Okay. Finally, let's move on to activities related to reviewing and editing. So here at the end, you can divide your classroom into two big groups. One group will be called the editing board, and the other group will be the reviewing board. So you may make each group to be seated in a line, okay, in the sense that each group or each line is facing parallelly the other group. And then you have to show the responsibilities of each group. The editing group is responsible for looking at any grammatical mistakes, any mechanics mistakes that can be found in the drafts. And the work of the editing board has to be done according to a pre-prepared rubric that you provide the editing board or the editing group. On the other hand, the reviewing board is responsible for looking at content and organization, and their work has to be done according to a content rubric. The items that need to be included and covered in the texts. You have to set a time for this, for example, 10 minutes, and after each side finishes their work, they start sharing their findings to the opposite group. So, for example, reviewing group starts sharing their findings to the editing group. For example, the points in the content that need to be modified, the points that need to be fixed related to the organization, and the editing board has to do those modifications. The editing board, on the other hand, has to share their modifications to the reviewing board. What mistakes or what grammatical mistakes are spotted and what modifications are needed to be done. Okay, so at the end of the sequence or the process of writing, you'll find that students have practiced the four stages and have produced a neat and organized text. So one final comment on this, that if your class is completely devoted to writing, so you can go through the four stages at once. You start with an activity for the inventing stage, and then you move on to another activity for drafting, and then you move on to an activity that combines editing or reviewing, or you can even think of an activity for each stage, the reviewing and the editing. However, if your class is not devoted to writing, writing is only a section. So this means that I'll be working on one stage at a time. So for example, today I'll be working on the inventing stage, and then ask my students to work on the drafting stage at home. Or next class, I'll be working on the drafting. Okay, and then I ask my students to work on the reviewing and editing stages based on rubrics that I provide them. Okay, so it depends on how much time you have, and whether the class is completely devoted to writing or that writing is only one section of the class. Okay, so this is an example of the content rubric, and this is an example of the language and structure rubric. One more comment, the content of the rubrics depends on the level of your students, the topic that you provide them, the level of sophistication that you need to see, and for sure, the language and structures that you taught your students. Because I cannot ask them to demonstrate something I haven't taught them. Okay, so I hope those activities can help you uh, make writing interesting in your classes, and those are the references that I based my work on. Thank you.